On a quiet morning in Richmond in the summer of 1806, a shocking crime sent waves through the early American Republic. A man of stature, wisdom, and great influence, along with others in his home, were deliberately harmed by a calculated act. But who would dare to take the life of one of the most revered legal minds in the country? This is the story of the murder of George Wythe, a crime woven with greed, betrayal, and lingering questions that remain unanswered to this day. In the following episode, we set the stage for a saga that shook Virginia to its core, going in depth to reveal the ruthless crime that took the life of a prestigious legal scholar, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a mentor to Thomas Jefferson and others. From his earlier home in Colonial Williamsburg, we reflect on the premeditated events that took place at his later home in Richmond, Virginia. Along the way, clarifying the evidence and the trial that shed light on the many mysteries and strange coincidences surrounding his death. Unraveling the happenings as we explore his entire house from each unique vantage point we come across. The hallways, dining room, and parlor, to his office, the second-story rooms, and the rear yard. The story of George Wythe's murder will be carefully laid out from start to finish. We also venture to locate the area his old home once stood, deep in the heart of Richmond, Virginia. The exact location where the unfortunate murder was carried out. And after discovering the fate of the trial and the critical injustices that took place, on a cold and eerie rainy day, I seek out the final resting place of this esteemed founding father, located in the cemetery yard of Richmond's First Church. The place where Patrick Henry famously recited a line for the ages. Although this story is not one of ghosts, apparitions, or spirits of the past taking up residence in their former homes, and speaking of the record of George Wythe's death, those with vivid imaginations and a curiosity for the paranormal often claim that he returns to his former home each year, still harboring frustration and disbelief over his own tragic fate. Over the decades, many have reported strange occurrences taking place at the Wythe house, whether it's said to be George himself returning and making his presence known, or other residents that once stayed here causing a ghostly disturbance. Either way, this story will not embark into the realm of the supernatural. Instead, it will simply use his famous home in Colonial Williamsburg as the partial platform for detailing the historical, eye-opening details of his final days and hours that took place at his home in Richmond. But dare we say that this place, a magnificent dwelling still standing today along the Palace Green in the bustling restored capital of colonial Virginia, not far from the prestigious governor's palace, may actually be a place that a man of George Wythe's stature, torn from life so suddenly and tragically, might still feel tethered to. Whether by memory, history, or something more mysterious. During the time George Wythe lived in Williamsburg, he practiced law, was a burgess, left for a year after he was elected as Virginia's delegate to the Second Continental Congress, taking the place of George Washington, who took command of the Continental Army. He then returned to Williamsburg the following year to become Speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates and later teaching law at the College of William and Mary. He lived here with his second wife Elizabeth after receiving the home as a wedding gift from her father until she died here in 1787. A former slave owner, but later teaching against it, he freed the enslaved individuals of his household, with those who chose to stay becoming employed by him and paid for their work and service. After retiring in 1789, only a couple years later, Wythe decided to leave Williamsburg and moved to Richmond, Virginia, as he was appointed to be a judge of the High Court of Chancery. This move firmly planted him in Richmond, the capital of Virginia after Williamsburg, where the crime carried out against him wouldn't unfold for nearly 15 years after his arrival. As I stood amazed looking at the different items kept in Wythe's parlor from within his former home in Williamsburg, I pondered the possibility of a parlor with similar taste to this one inside his Richmond home. A two-story home which is reported to have once stood near the corner of Grace and 5th Street in the inner city. The place where an unexpected series of events would suddenly alter his life story. The house is no longer there, but I learned there was in fact a sign that commemorated the spot where it used to stand, and I knew I wanted to try to find it.
You said it's a right turn, right?
Just keep going straight. I'm gonna go left at this light.
At this light?
Yeah, this light.
All right, Sarah's gonna find the general location and drop me off. And I'm gonna get out and see if I can locate the sign that marks the location of George Wythe's old home in the center of Richmond, Virginia. Guarded from the downwash winds and the occasional drizzle by a flimsy umbrella, Sarah dropped me off nearby the location his old place was said to have been located. Now out and about the city that had been built on hills, often earning its suggested comparison to Rome by those living in the 18th century, I braved the cold and sought out this mounted placard of special significance.
And here it is. The sign commemorating the site of the home of George Wythe, signer of the Declaration of Independence. And it looks like it was placed by the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities all the way back in 1907.
It may only be a single solitary early 20th century relic that still signifies Wythe's former presence in the capital city then. But I knew when I found it and viewed it up close, my mind would run rampant with all that had taken place there during his lifetime. In Richmond, Wythe was admired by many for his astonishing achievements. Those that knew him and had grown accustomed to seeing him in the flourishing capital of Virginia, the city thriving with opportunity, understood who he was and the importance of his role in the country's early quest for freedom. He was held in high regard by those who once served and were still living since their service in the Revolutionary War. A man of advancing age, they understood many years prior, this resilient and intelligent patriot inked his signature onto a historic piece of parchment listed among other statesmen that became our Declaration of Independence from the Crown. Pausing in the hallway of George Wythe's home in Williamsburg. The quiet of the home, almost tangible as I thought about the past here. When Wythe resided here, the house saw many guests, including his sister Anne, who would have frequently visited. It's not certain that she was ever accompanied by her very young grandson, little George Wythe Sweeney, who took the name of his famous relative and who would have only been an infant when his granduncle still lived here. I read one story that claimed, as a child, little Sweeney enjoyed spending time at the Wythe house in Williamsburg, where George and his wife were said to have kept toys for him. But I'm not entirely sure if this is accurate due to a discrepancy in years. But if it were true, like any child, he would have been undoubtedly delighted to play with him during visits inside a house of this caliber. Touring the home out of sequence and in no formal order, I climbed the original staircase of George Wythe's home, using the same steps he would have once ascended. As I climbed, in my mind I tried to imagine what the interior of his later home in Richmond would have looked like with every room I approached, transporting my thoughts to the very place where sudden calamity quickly surfaced in later years. As young George Wythe Sweeney grew into his teenage years and now living with Wythe in his new home, signs of rebellious behavior became increasingly evident. Looking around the first, second-story bedchamber I came to, I wondered if a very young Sweeney ever stayed in this room during visits with his grandmother. For some strange reason, I easily imagined him here. The space felt oddly familiar, like it held the weight of time. As I stood there, I thought about how, despite the turmoil that often filled the household in later years in Richmond, George Wythe the Elder remained steadfast in his care for his grandnephew. He continued to give Sweeney the benefit of the doubt, even writing him into his will to receive a significant portion of his property in the hope it might guide him toward a better future. Strange incidents occurred, such as stealing books from Wythe's personal library and apparently attempting to auction them off for quick money. As a collector of rare and unique items, Wythe owned a special terrestrial globe, possibly once stored in the second-story storage room I was now exploring, along with other interesting relics and 18th century gadgetry. It's told that one day, the globe mysteriously went missing, and some came to believe Sweeney was responsible for its disappearance. According to Wythe's will, the globe was believed to be among the items given to his friend Thomas Jefferson, then President of the United States.
This is a letter he actually wrote, a copy of one, wrote to his factor in London, saying that I want you to use some of my tobacco money to buy one of these devices right here.
Solar projector. So this would be an invention from the 18th century.
Intrigued by the findings of this 18th century domain, before I left the room, I glanced through the magnifying glass on the table, honing in on the signatures of the bold 56 who signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, including George Wythe and his good friend Thomas Jefferson. Some of those who worked in George Wythe's house through the years, like Lydia Broadnax, recalled young Sweeney receiving special treatment and freedoms, privileges that reflected the status of a son more so than a relative. Still roaming around upstairs, doing my best to imagine the similarities between Wythe's home here in Williamsburg and his later one in Richmond, where the scene of the crime unfolded, I stepped inside another room that I was told was a guest bedchamber. A hard-working Lydia would have most definitely tended to this space on many occasions in the years she lived in Williamsburg before moving to Richmond with Wythe in 1791. As Wythe's cook and loyal attendant, she got to know his young grandnephew well over the years. Often rude, demanding, and self-serving, Sweeney lived by his own roles, disregarding the guidance of Wythe and others in the household. The rules that should have curbed his poor decision-making were never enforced, allowing him to do as he pleased. These were just a few indicators that Wythe's grandnephew was taking advantage of him and ultimately posed a threat to his way of life. As the capital of Richmond boomed, the city became plagued by inner-city crime and violence. Local taverns overflowed with barrels of booze, and rowdy patrons often found themselves in heated barroom scuffles. Racial tensions swept through the streets. City infrastructure crumbled, and rapid population growth left many struggling, hungry, desperate for money and housing, and without work. Gambling was another widespread infestation in the city, and one that was known to severely infect teenage Sweeney's careless judgment. It seemed in an effort to nudge him on track, when George Wythe learned of his addiction with reckless wagering and keeping bad company, it's been told that he once warned him that he may lose his inheritance should he continue his obsession with risk-taking and associating with ill-bred scoundrels. In some ways, it seemed to me, this statement may have enticed the young troublemaker to take a closer look at all he would be entitled to as a principal beneficiary of his granduncle's last will and testament. Continuing to explore throughout George Wythe's home, I was riveted by what I was absorbing. Being inside his home, visualizing him in each room I came to, it was easy to paint historical scenes in my mind, and I became lost in amazement with the slightest of things, like realizing that this was the exact door he would have used when he still lived here.
Tell me the door is original.
Yes.
Sarah, that's an original door. So that means George Wythe closed this door at one point in time.
Yes.
That these were the exact floors that Wythe, Washington, Rochambeau, and other well-known figures from the 18th century once walked over.
The original floor.
Thinking of the misfortune that took place years after he moved from this home in Williamsburg. In my research for this story, I drew from several sources that sparked much interest, especially those regarding the murder. One of the most significant of these was a book I had recently read, which played a large part in shaping the account I'm presenting throughout this episode. The book was written by George Wythe Munford, the son of William Munford, one of George Wythe's former pupils and close friends. Named after the influential founding father by his family, he drew on memories of past conversations and remarks his father made about the murder to write the story. 75 years after the events took place, his published account of the crime likely contains errors, misinterpretations, and inaccuracies, as it's based mostly on hearsay. How much of the book is factual or embellished can't be entirely determined, but an interesting connection that could have led the author to pen a more accurate recounting than some may suggest is the fact that his father was the clerk of court at the time of the murder. Could have been the one to have conducted actual eyewitness testimonies. Observing the layout and antiquities placed on the center table inside Wythe's office, I recalled a part of the published story regarding the murder that included testimony from Wythe's liberated and loyal attendant, Lydia Broadnax, which Mr. Mumford, the author, recalled his father speaking about often. In it, she claims Sweeney waited for his granduncle to head out to work one day, as he often would do, and once gone, he snuck into his office and found the key to Wythe's desk, which led to discovering his last will and testament. Unexpectedly, while Lydia was working throughout the house, she caught Sweeney in the midst of curiously overlooking its details. The boy barked at her and selfishly told her his granduncle wanted him to review it. It's not entirely certain, but his disposition towards the specifics he read may have led foolish George Wythe Sweeney to orchestrate a plan to eliminate those who stood between him and receiving a full inheritance as outlined in his granduncle's will. If the former enslaved members of the household were removed, Sweeney could swindle everything. Desperate and delusional, a couple of weeks later, he was reportedly seeking to purchase ratsbane, a deadly form of arsenic. If true, it was apparent he was devising a sinister plot. In the dining room of George Wythe's old Colonial Williamsburg dwelling, peering through his old looking glass that clearly reflected its age, I thought of that fateful morning on May 25th, 1806 in Richmond, Virginia, when tragedy so suddenly struck. The day began with what was later recalled by Lydia, Sweeney hurrying down the stairs impatiently, asking for a hot cup of coffee and toast, hastily remarking that he needed to get going. A slight conversation between the two of them took place as Lydia began preparing his toast. Sweeney moved towards the open fire and latched a hold of the kettle, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Whether it was her peripheral vision or a clear view, Lydia later testified she saw him throw a small piece of white paper into the blazing fire, but at the time, she didn't suspect anything of it. Still surveilling the dining room of his home in Colonial Williamsburg, standing silent but still very mesmerizing, with the aura of his presence still lingering here. Sources from the past state George Wythe was said to have woken up that morning in Richmond feeling refreshed. And as he routinely did, he headed outside to draw himself water for his early morning shower bath. Probably a close equal to his armchair that sat inside his bedchamber at his home in Williamsburg. After rinsing off, he sat in his favorite seat in the bedroom, with some accounts stating reading over Richmond's weekly newspaper when Lydia, his liberated servant since 1787, brought him a small breakfast that he had requested. The exact contents of the breakfast are uncertain, but it was believed to be light, with a kettle or cup of Wythe's preferred morning beverage. Starting his day potentially getting caught up on current events, or perhaps looking out his bedroom window, pondering his official duties down at the Chancery Court. As he sat there enjoying his first home-cooked fare of the day while sipping some early morning coffee, George Wythe's day begun like it had for many a year. Some quick conversation during their exchange is said to have taken place before Lydia left the room, with one account mentioning he asked her about leaving his keys in his desk. Her reply confirmed he in fact had, and that she had found Sweeney sitting at his desk, and according to the boy's response to her, it was requested by Wythe for him to read over the document. His reply to her suggested his old age was affecting his memory, and he didn't recall the interaction he had with a troublesome teenager. Described as being tied by a blue ribbon, and earlier placed in George's desk by Lydia herself, whom George trusted and tasked her to do for him. The will detailed everyone in the house who were beneficiaries of it. Their names included in the will could have fueled Sweeney's greed and frustration, feeling that the former enslaved servants of Wythe's household should not be entitled to anything from his older relative's estate, probably believing that only blood heirs had the right to inherit. After serving George Wythe his coffee and breakfast, Lydia recalled that she and Michael Brown, the younger freed worker of the household, also had breakfast and a cup of coffee, as they often did in the early morning hours. As the morning crept forward, not long after partaking in their morning meal, George became increasingly sick and in excruciating pain. Lydia and Michael would become sick too sometime later. With only a short time passing since ingestion and nearly debilitated already, Wythe asked Lydia to quickly send for a doctor. The recollection of her account, detailed in the book by George Wythe Munford, called The Two Parsons, states that she became highly suspicious Sweeney had poisoned them. No matter the validity and timing of the statements that perceived Sweeney's guilt, and if they were truly remarked as supposedly accounted, the most damning, obvious evidence early on, from any perspective, seemed to be the fact that young George Wythe Sweeney was the only one that morning who avoided being poisoned. Making my way into the first-floor bedchamber of Wythe's home in Williamsburg, a room with fanciful patterned wallpaper with a rich, vibrant color and design that more than likely reflected the style and taste of the woman of the house. After prolonged illness, she passed away here in 1787. Panning my eyes across the room, at the center of the chamber was a large canopy bed. It seemed like it would have been a pleasant hideaway for a midday nap, and the room itself a comfortable retreat where one could coordinate the household agenda for the day. Gazing out the room's window towards the rear garden area, a variety of outbuildings ran parallel to the main brick walkway, which leads to the naturally covered pergola that still was currently asleep in the midst of winter. A similar rear yard geography, tailored to his preference for how a backyard should complement his home, might have encompassed the grounds of George Wythe's later home in Richmond. Likened to one of these small exterior facilities that were essential to everyday life in the 18th century, was where, days prior to the events of the unforeseen tragedy, a worker of Wythe's saw Sweeney using an axe to chop a material he was uncertain of inside one of the workshops. Later, a yellow residue was discovered on the axe that appeared to match a common color tone found in a specific type of arsenic. previous and new evidence continued to quickly shed light on the probability of Sweeney's corrupt plan. 2 days after the poisoning, he had ignorantly struck again. This time, an attempt to cash a $100 check at the Bank of Virginia, bearing the forged signature of his granduncle, who is now at home fighting for his life. When the bank subverted the attempt by claiming that they believed there must be a mistake, it said that Sweeney hesitantly put up the money to cover the forged check, which ultimately depicted a signal of guilt. Suspicious and aware of the attempt to counterfeit a signature, the bank teller, a man named William Dandridge, reported the forgery to the police. The same teller later is said to have recalled previous transactions of at least 5 or more forged checks signed using George Wythe's name, cashed by Sweeney prior to the poisoning. The day after, Sweeney was immediately arrested for forgery, placed on a hefty $1,000 bond, leaving little chance for bail. Meanwhile, his prestigious relative, now gravely ill, declined to offer any assistance as the latest revelations unfolded. Traces of the crime continued to surface evidence of the plot. Some reports indicate that the arresting officer who searched Sweeney found 2 small packets containing arsenic in his pocket, yet, for reasons unknown, failed to confiscate them upon his arrest. Coincidentally, a few days later, a jailer found a small wrapped bundle of arsenic outside the jail grounds, beyond the prison wall where inmates were allowed to roam. Additionally, traces of arsenic were found inside a chest in Sweeney's room. The doctors who were almost immediately dispatched to address the situation inside Wythe's home near the corner of 5th and Gray Street in Richmond provided a grim outlook of the situation. In Wythe's own words, as he suffered in deep physical agony, he described never having endured such pain in his life. The doctors privately projected to their colleagues that death was imminent. However, based on his age, Wythe's body was holding up better than expected, showing some resilience despite the circumstances. Lydia and Michael, vital to the household's daily routines, those slower to show signs of poisoning in comparison to Wythe, were now becoming violently ill. Michael, in particular, appeared to be in the worst condition as the days wore on. A letter written to then President Thomas Jefferson by George Wythe's executor revealed that on the morning of Sunday, June 1st, Sweeney's apparent act of malicious deception claimed its first victim. The hard-working boy whom Wythe had taught Latin, Greek, and math, who some claimed was the son of Lydia, and who George saw as a humble, well-mannered, and good-natured individual. The youngest member of the Wythe estate, Michael Brown, had died. An autopsy later confirmed the cause of death, revealing heavy inflammation in the stomach, consistent with poisoning from yellow arsenic. Upon hearing this tragic news, a suffering George Wythe summoned enough strength to make an amendment to his will. Realizing that the plot threatening the lives of those in his household was intentional. Though he did not directly name Sweeney as the perpetrator, Wythe, despite his misery and physical affliction, maintained a stoic presence and declared to those at his bedside, "I am murdered." While he did not explicitly name Sweeney as the culprit, his decision to remove his grandnephew as a beneficiary of the will clearly indicated that he saw him as the one responsible for the betrayal. As I continued exploring Wythe's home in Williamsburg, reflecting on all that had transpired, one interesting detail about the event stood out to me, further revealing Wythe's keen awareness of the legal situation and the eventual outcome of the crime. Tormented by discomfort in the realization of his approaching demise, yet still managing to maintain some composure, Wythe is said to have shared with those around him in his final hours that due to the inability for the courts to use the testimony of the freed black woman living in the house who was also poisoned, he felt Sweeney couldn't be convicted based on the law of the time. But only time would tell if he was correct. Incarcerated for well over a week, awaiting trial for forgery, George Wythe Sweeney sat in jail for the crimes he had committed, likely contemplating in his solitude whether more trouble was looming just around the corner. On a warm Sunday morning on June 8th of 1806, 2 weeks after the shocking incident, George Wythe passed away. But in the days prior, some accounts claim he made a startling request, telling his doctors to cut him, a somber reference to performing a post-mortem autopsy after his death. He is also said to have graciously asked from his deathbed, "Let me die righteous." A long and valiant life of service and duty to strangers, family, friends, and his country. The prominent mind and lifetime achievements of an esteemed, intelligent founding father, whose signature and legacy will be imprinted in the fabric of time. George Wythe was gone. Still incarcerated for forgery while pending trial, on June 18, 1806, just weeks after their death, George Wythe Sweeney was finally charged with the premeditated murders of George Wythe and Michael Brown. Thereafter, 2 separate courts of examination and a grand jury charged him with murder and the forgeries that he had carried out. His fate would be determined at the district court in Richmond in September of that year. Although various records and testimonies regarding the trial that took place painted altering theories of how the case was carried out and determined, the evidence seemed to show that Sweeney intentionally poisoned Wythe, Broadnecks, and Brown. The court of public opinion, close allies, friends, family of Chancellor Wythe, and even the President of the United States all clearly saw Sweeney guilty as charged. But on a Monday morning on September 1st, 1806, both sides in the case deliberated. A short snippet in the Tuesday morning, September 9th Richmond Enquirer announced the verdict, reading, "After an able and eloquent discussion, the jury retired and in a few minutes brought in a verdict of not guilty. Sweeney was acquitted due to failure of proof of intent." And for the death of the teenage boy, Michael Brown, whom George admired so much, he didn't see justice either, with the charge being dismissed without trial. Though argued if factual, George Wythe, in his final hours of life in this world, had earlier predicted that Sweeney wouldn't be charged, and he was indeed right. For the conviction of forgery, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison and a lengthy amount of time on the pillory. but somehow this too never happened. The main reason for the lack of conviction was the law at the time. Black people were simply not allowed to testify against whites. And had the freed black woman of the house, Lydia Broadnax, who was also poisoned but survived, been able to testify, her words alone could have helped to solidify Sweeney's guilt. Maybe one of the most unfortunate ironies surrounding the trial was that the legal reforms of 1779, led by Jefferson, Pendleton, and Wythe, maintained the colonial-era law barring black individuals from testifying against white people. Whether they upheld the code unintentionally or simply failed to prioritize its removal is unclear, but its continued existence significantly influenced the trial's outcome. It was the very law that allowed Sweeney to avoid a death sentence. The intermittent rain in Richmond on the day of my inner city exploration near Wythe's old home dealt me short bursts of umbrella-free navigating, but never for too long. Momentarily back in the warmth of the van, after braving the frigid cold midday in Virginia's capital, Sarah and I now set out to locate the place where George Wythe was laid to rest. After years of visiting his home in Colonial Williamsburg, I wanted to pay my respects to a most noble of founding fathers that by this point I felt like I knew better than I ever have in all my years coming to Virginia. Back on June 10th, 1806, the Richmond Enquirer printed a special design on its pages in honor of George Wythe's life, a thick black border surrounding the text of the news pages, with a large section of the paper reserved for the announcement of the order of procession for his funeral service, which had taken place a couple days earlier. A lengthy and well-deserved biography of his life and character filled the pages. Other newspapers nationwide also reflected on the amazing life that George Wythe led, revealing the magnitude of respect he earned from so many. When I learned that the cemetery he was buried at was at the first church built in Richmond, I quickly discovered I was embarking on a location steeped in much history. Walking through its entrance, with the church looming in the distance, the sheer age, style, and condition of each tombstone that I passed by confirmed these hallowed grounds were centuries old. Although it's thought that Wythe was buried on the western side of the churchyard, the exact spot of his remains are not known. As I looked for the monument that honors his resting place, I had an opportunity to explore the graveyard.
Somewhere near the church, I've read, is the gravestone of George Wythe. It's just a matter of finding it. But similar to Bruton Parish Church, this church is known to have very old gravestones, including this one right here, Elizabeth Arnold Poe. Governor John Page. And a lot of these old graves are so old you can barely read what it says just from the years of enduring the weather. This is definitely an old one. I believe I see 1793. Just that old flat style stone. It's pretty eerie to see. definitely are showing their age.
In the 18th century, St. John's was known as Henrico Parish Church. As I got a closer look at the massive stained glass windows, I thought of the enormous amount of historical happenings that took place inside and the array of famous freedom fighters that once attended this church. In the 1770s, this was a meeting place to plan protest during the lead-up to the Revolutionary War. 1775, the Second Virginia Convention was held here. Originally planned to meet at the Capitol building in Williamsburg, but due to the threat of British interference, delegates of the convention, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Peyton Randolph, Patrick Henry, and George Wythe, once met here to determine how Virginia should respond to the tyranny of the crown. It was quite mesmerizing to realize that the bold voices of great American patriots once rung out within the church's walls. It's inside this very church where the outspoken orator, Patrick Henry, delivered his most famous lines from a speech that took place here on March 23, 1775.
Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty, give me death.
The grounds of this sacred church, a fitting final resting place for the venerable George Wythe to lay peacefully for all of time. As I came around the corner, I noticed a tall, rounded monument that I knew from afar had to be his memorial stone. With deep respect, I stood at the final resting place of George Wythe, a distinguished architect of our Union, whose life was marked by a strong dedication to this country and its people.
And it reads, "This tablet is dedicated to mark the site where lie the mortal remains of George Wythe, born 1726, died in 1806, jurist and statesman, teacher of Randolph, Jefferson, and Marshall, first professor of the law in the United States, and first Virginia signer of the Declaration of Independence." The stone commemorating the resting spot of George Wythe.
In a few quiet moments of reflection, I felt a strong connection, closer than ever before to the life he once lived and the legacy he left behind. Standing in silence, I honored his memory, but also the remarkable life he led in service to others. As I walked from George Wythe's grave, still feeling a few droplets mixed with the cool air, his story continued to linger in my mind. A man whose intellect and integrity helped shape a nation, yet whose life ended in tragedy. Passing through the quiet meadows of the cemetery, I found myself thinking about the injustices he faced and the way his death left many questions still unanswered. The overcast sky mirrored my thoughts, a reminder of the shadows that sometimes follow even the brightest lives. As I left, I carried with me the memory of George Wythe, now sealed in my mind like a time capsule. His story forever remembered, a story I now hold, not just for myself, but to share with others, so his legacy lives on.